quickly introduce myself in the panel. My name is Tajha Chappellet-Lanier. I'm a reporter at FedScoop. I write about IT systems in the federal government. And so rarely about crowdsourcing, but from time to time. And I also have a panel of experts here who are far more expert than me, so I'm going to hope that they have lots of interesting things to share. Moving down the line, we have Drumwright, who's the CEO of Popin. Is that how you pronounce the name of the company? Excellent. It's a software company that allows leaders to crowdsource feedback from their teams, as far as I understand. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Awesome. Next we have Xavier Hughes. He's the Chief Technology and Innovation Officer at ICMA. And before that, he was the Chief Innovation Officer at the Department of Labor. So that's going to be our future of work expert right there. And then finally, last but not least at the end, Joanne is the CEO of Synthetron. Is that pronunciation right? Awesome. They help leaders and decision makers keep a finger on the pulse through crowdsourcing, and she's been in this space for 10 years, has a lot of expertise to share. Fantastic. So I think what I want to start off with first is the biggest possible question, and then we'll kind of work our way backward from that. So I think the title of this panel really begs the question, what is the impact of crowdsourcing on the future of work? And I think as a way to think about that question, I would love to know when you guys see this panel title or when you hear that question, you think about what crowdsourcing is going to mean for the future of work, what are some considerations that pop to mind right away? And if you could share those.
Okay. Crowdsourcing is an interesting technology because it puts a lot of pressure on leaders. When I think future of the work, most of my experience is in corporate America and working with corporations, Fortune 1000. I don't know how many of you have ever seen the Tour de France, but in the Tour de France, they have this thing called a peloton, and that's where, hundreds of riders are all grouped together. And what'll happen in almost every race every day is that there will be a breakaway group from the peloton. And the breakaway group breaks away at a specific time. Usually it's 2 or 3 people. And the goal of the peloton is to reel in the breakaway group before the end of that day and try to win the race. And the breakaway group is trying to break away with enough people that they can drag off each other and stay ahead of the peloton. And it's pretty exciting to watch. And I think that's what crowdsourcing is going to do to corporate America. What you're going to have is you're going to have leaders that are okay being vulnerable, okay with transparency, okay admitting they don't know everything and that no one of us is smarter than all of us. And they're going to go out to their teams and they're going to be trying to figure out how to share authorship on initiatives, how to share authorship on big projects and strategy in a way that makes sense for the business. And when they do that successfully, they're going to get a lot of buy-in from their teams, and their teams are going to be more productive than the leaders that kind of want to stick their head in the sand and not maybe shine a spotlight on anything that might be wrong with the business. And in doing that, they're going to break away from the other people in the organization, and then those 70, 80% that maybe don't want to shine a spotlight on the things that are tough in the business are going to have a choice of whether they catch up or not. And I think for the leadership side, I think it's going to be really challenging. And we see that with Popin. We see that across the board when we work with corporations, that there is a group. You can go to HR and say, who are the 5, 10 best leaders in the organization? And they love our product because we are really getting them information on stuff that's really hard to get honest answers on. But the rest of the organization usually will kind of be like, I'll wait and see. So that'd be my answer.
So good afternoon. I just want to make sure that it was afternoon and not morning still. I'm a little turned around today. Future of work. I see the future of work as the death of the generalist. I think that we've relied on generalists from the large institutional point of view for a very, very long time and for no real reason. So crowdsourcing efforts are taking that out little by little, and in some cases in a very painful manner from large organizations in the public and private sector, probably more in the public than in the private. And then you've got the issue that on some industries. So manufacturing, for example, 30% of associated tasks with the workforce can be automated, right? So you've got that piece that's being influenced by the automation side, and then you've got another piece that's influenced by the crowdsourcing point of view, which means that instead of having one person working 8 or 9 hours, you're going to have two people splitting that shift. So like that, you know, they provide different points of view, you know, similar skills, one more hyper-specialized than the other in one aspect, and the other one more hyper-specialized than the other in the other aspect. So you're going to see a lot of hyper-specialization, and I would encourage, if you have children or you're planning on having children, to focus on that, because otherwise they're going to have a really hard time finding a job. And lastly, crowdsourcing has been extremely beneficial in terms of cost cutting for the federal government, which was my previous employer, and for the current employer that I have, and local governments. Why? Because you've got in DC the traditional Beltway bandits, as I call them, very large technology providers that have been for a long time charging an arm and a leg for, you know, services and products that don't really demand that type of price level. And as you saw in the previous presentation with NASA, and they did a phenomenal job, the cost of doing business is dropping dramatically, and a lot of these large service providers are suffering because of it. Why? Because they didn't embrace the crowdsourcing model. They stayed with their current employee base, and a lot of them are losing a lot of money because of it. We shouldn't feel bad about it. We should feel great about it, because actually we're cutting a lot of costs. So I'll leave it at that, and that's how I see it.
Pretty doomy pictures. And I think there is a very risky, challenging, and we saw NASA showing this famous slide of freelancers versus workers taking over. There are studies by McKinsey that they say 50% of the jobs are going to disappear. So a lot of doom, and the doom is to do a lot with the outsourcing of tasks. I think there's also another element in there. I think there's also a good thing that can happen is that crowdsourcing is not only outsourcing tasks, it's also engaging people. And so you create kind of a new engagement within corporations, but you also get a creation of communities and belonging. So I think that there is also a positive side that we may have. Today we have heads as mother, wife, businessman, colleague, the whole thing. We will probably have a couple of heads belonging to this work community, that work community, and a third work community. And that can actually be quite pleasant if the crowdsourcing is engaging. So I want to kind of counter that there is a doomy thing, and I realize that specialization is probably going to be one of the solutions. Although I always found that the doom is to do with big data and with artificial intelligence is going to take over a lot of the tasks. I am a bit more skeptical on that because it needs big data. It needs millions of data. And any task that is not to do with millions of data is not going to be automated that easily. So I'm less skeptical.
Great. I want to continue kind of along those lines of some of the risks and benefits. I think you all work, a number of you work in crowdsourcing in some sense. You're clearly here today. So I would say that you probably see a lot of positives to what crowdsourcing can do for the workforce or for society writ large. What are some of the key positives you see to transitioning to a workforce that is utilizing crowdsourcing on a basis, on a growing basis?
I can talk about it from more of the large workforce point of view. And to your point, there are a lot of positive aspects to crowdsourcing. One of them, and I'm going to talk about the positive in this instance because I already captured the negative. On the positive side, you're going to have a lot of people that are going to be able to do what they actually want to do versus what they've been kind of like thrown into that they weren't really like passionate about. So that's That's one thing that we're going to see. You're also going to see individuals that are able to spread their wings and be far more entrepreneurial, and worry less and less about being, following the same structure that we followed over the past, 100 or so years. You want to succeed, you got to go to college. You got to go to college. You got to get a 4-year degree. You got to get a 4-year degree. You got to get a graduate degree. Then potentially you got to get a PhD. Well, these days, who can afford that, right? You really can't, unless you want to carry $350,000 worth of debt. So with the crowdsourcing opportunities and all these platforms and all these new mechanisms, you can circumvent that. And if you can be self-taught, you can train yourself, you can do it very economically through a lot of online training and a lot of other, more economical classes. And then you can actually become a true subject matter expert that can work in areas where you really feel passionate about and reap the benefits of it. And not only individually, but collectively we'll reap the benefits of it. So I see a lot of good in that, if you ask me.
I think there's something else. That crowdsourcing is basically about the decentralized model of an organization of human beings. And what you see is that big organizations, and we got the story from NASA doing it as well, is trying to take some of the benefits of that in their organization structure. And you see that you get more decentralized, you get stuff, in the Netherlands or in Europe, you have a bank, ING. They are no longer in bosses, they're in tribes and tribe leaders, and they work totally decentralized. Probably will find a middle way. This is like a very extreme way, but I think what is also a good benefit of it is that the organizational structures are changing. You see that you have like an e-democracy movement. We joined the first G1000. That's a kind of way to complement for a government, which is a one-time every 4 years vote. So I think there's a lot of organizational change that is going to happen, and that actually is inspired by crowdsourcing and crowd connecting.
So I'll talk just from the perspective of using crowdsourcing to have honest conversations, not for like outsourcing work or like Top Coder or one of those types of things. Really, the huge benefit that I see is that a leader has a really hard time building trust with their employees, because once you get past 30 or 40 employees, it's almost impossible for those employees to know you as a leader. It's very difficult. I talked with the president of Arrow, which is a huge corporation in Denver, and he said, man, my employees can follow LeBron James or Obama or any of these guys on social media, and most of them have never met me or would have any idea of how to get past my admin. Yet I could make a video talking about a problem that I'm dealing with as a leader, and I could ask a question at the end of that video, and I could anonymously get answers from all 1,000 people in my group about how they'd solve that problem. And then I could go in with my name showing, them anonymous, my name showing, and I could respond to some of their answers, especially the stuff that gets voted to the top, and all of a sudden they have real access to me. And that's a huge benefit, because building trust, if you think about the most high-performing team you've ever been on, you mattered on that team, right? Whether it's a sports team or whether it's a business or a club you were in, you mattered, and your voice mattered. And how do you make 1,000 people in your department feel like they matter? Well, they have to feel that they have some access to you, and that you can see their opinions and that you could act on their opinions. And for most leaders without technology, that's just a very difficult thing to do. So I think crowdsourcing, the problem we're trying to solve is really that. We're trying to solve that and help leaders build trust so then they can figure out where people are confused, drive clarity, and then get buy-in. And if you do that successfully, you can really move a business pretty quickly, because everybody feels like they're in the boat rowing with you.
Do you find, just out of curiosity, do you find that, what is the solution that your clients were using for this problem before? Were they...
I love this. So you do engagement surveys, right? And engagement surveys, I speak to HR groups all the time. And I was like, how many of you had communications come back as top 2 or 3 issues? And every hand goes up. And I was like, well, do you guys suck at your jobs? And then like the crowd goes quiet, and I'm like, well, if it comes back as communications is the problem every single year, why aren't you solving for it? And what they'll say is, well, we're doing more newsletters, we're doing more town halls, we're doing more emails, we're doing more, but that is one-way communication, right? That's command and control, everything top down. How did the crowd ever get to speak back on any of that? Maybe you do open office hours, maybe you manage by walking around. There's all these things that we've tried to do and got taught in business school. But until you can have a conversation where both sides get to speak, you're never going to be able to build that trust. So I really think, for me, I built Popin out of need because I was running a company where once we got past 70 people and then we were doubling in people every single year, year over year, it became impossible to hold the culture because you've got more people coming into the company every year that have somebody else's culture than the one you spent 2 or 3 years building. And that becomes very difficult. So you've got to have a way that you can communicate and they can communicate back and you can make sense out of it. Can't just be some open answer survey where you get 1,000 answers. You've got to have voting on it so you can make sense out of it and figure out where the common voice is.
Fantastic. So, I mean, trust, a kind of entrepreneurial experience, building these kinds of communities. Those are obviously fantastic benefits or positives around crowdsourcing. I want to go to the flip side, the more challenging question. What are the challenges? What are the negatives, if you want to use a negative word, or the challenges, and how do we need to think about those from your perspectives?
I've got a ton on this, but when you guys want to go?
No, that one works too.
Okay. Well, if you look about challenges in crowdsourcing, and I now will also refer to actually crowdsourcing in companies, which we have a lot of experience with. The challenge is actually to follow up, because crowdsourcing is not a free meal. If you ask people for their opinion, they come with ideas, and you then don't follow up, you're actually worse off than you are before. So that's a first challenge. The other challenge is actually related to what we heard before. There has been some great talks about good questions. The challenge is really to ask a good question to the crowd, because if you induce a kind of a negative spiral, you can create a problem on top of the one that you want to solve. So there is quite some challenges in doing it right, but I would say from my experience, the most important one is actually the follow-up, because it's not a free meal. Yeah? And you create expectations, you create engagement, then you have to actually then act.
So I dealt with this firsthand at the U.S. Department of Labor. When I came in, an administration had never had a chief innovation officer. So I came in, I was the first cabinet one, and at that level, and fancy title, but really people did not know who I was and why I was there, and maybe I had given a large political donation, and maybe that's why I was there. Not true. I didn't even work in the campaign. But the challenge that I had is, to your point, people getting to know me, and who is this enigma, right? This person is like a character out of He-Man, right? It's like, who is this person? It sounds like a cartoon. And it was a lot of work. The first year was full of failures and some successes. And most of those failures were that people were either completely intimidated or not excited enough about participating because they had been burned in the past so many times. So the first thing that I had to do think about problem solving at the administration as crowdsourcing. That truly is crowdsourcing, right? And saying, look, we have a lot of issues. How can we collaborate together? So I had to create a whole infrastructure to solve a lot of these issues. And at the same time, you talk about leaders getting to know their individuals. There's a lot of responsibility falls on these leaders to make themselves more human. I can complain and say, well, people don't know me. Well, you can get up from your desk and you can walk around and you can shake hands and get people to know you. And if you have time to go to the bathroom and drink some water, you have time to go meet your employees. And that's how I see this. So I made a point to literally shake all 3,500 hands at the U.S. Department of Labor headquarters next to 395, and then do regional trips and meet the remaining of the 18,000 members. So There's a lot of, you need to humanize it, to your point. You really need to humanize it. But gathering feedback, to your point, is extremely difficult because you are fighting a culture that is not open to that. Outreach will combat that. Human resources will combat that. Overall assistant secretary for administration will combat that. Surveys are fine. SurveyMonkey's fine. No, it's not fine. It sucks. Right? We need to have something that's far more useful to capture honest, truthful feedback. And in relation to your point about continuity and follow through, we launched something called challenge.gov, which you might or might not know. And we use challenge.gov a lot to do problem solving. But one of the biggest issues that we had at the beginning across all agencies is that you posted your challenge, you posted a bounty, $35,000, $50,000, $150,000. Hey, can you create a mobile application for this? Can you solve this issue? Well, once the money's gone, people are gone. And then you can't find them to do follow-up, right? That's one of the initial challenges with crowdsourcing. So that's changed, obviously, but there's an operation and maintenance aspect of the post-initial production. So you need to be very aware about that in order to succeed. So like that you don't have a flash in the pan and then you're toast. Because then you're going to feel the brunt of it. Somebody's going to say, hey, where's 150K? Right? Well, it's gone. So think about that as you continue to embrace the whole crowdsourcing internally and externally.
So using your example, that we worked with Mattel and a bunch of telecom companies on this. They would hire a new executive in, right? So we'd call this, with Popin, we called it new leader assimilation. And this goes to the good and the bad of crowdsourcing, right? Because I agree with you. The worst thing you think you could do is not ask for anyone's opinion, but the worst thing you can do is ask their opinion and do nothing, right? That is definitely, I agree with you 100%. Going past that, for new leader assimilation, the one thing you want to know, like when you walk into a job like that, right, is like, what the hell am I walking into? Like, especially with that many people, there's a history, there's probably people that have a ton of tenure. So the question we ask is we walk in and we have the leader make a video that just plays in the app right when you open it. It's like, hey, new to the job, super excited to be here. Before I tell you anything about me, I'd love to know, what do you guys think the one thing is I should really focus in on when I come in? In that pop-in session, you will literally get everything that's wrong with the organization. Like you will get every possible thing, and then the voting will raise the worst things up to the top. Now, you'd be like, okay, that's great. I know exactly what I'm walking into, but actioning those things can be very tough. And our advice is, and what a lot of people do is they'll just freak out and they won't work on any of them, and they'll get on stage like they normally would, introduce themselves to everybody, and not really deal with any of it. The best thing you can do is actually take one or two of the really tough things, put some constraints around what you're allowed to do. So you could say, hey, for this thing that you guys said was the worst thing that we're dealing with, without any additional funding or any additional staffing, what could you at your level of the organization do to help solve this problem, right? So instead of, what crowdsourcing can do if you're not careful is create so much more work for the leader. But if you use crowdsourcing intelligently, what you can do is put the leader's constraints back on the problem and hand it to the group. And when you do that, they operate in such a more constructive way. And it actually buys a ton of patience for the leader that, wow, some of this stuff is actually kind of hard. And when they get in the boat and try to solve it with you, it can be incredibly effective for you to really start out immediately as a leader that listens and cares about how they want to solve the problem. And it really, like, for the engagement in the group and your engagement scores as a leader, through the roof.
Is it working? Yeah. I'd like to add something to that, which is actually often a bit of a misconception, I think. Crowdsourcing is not a decision tool. Crowdsourcing is an input tool. And it's still up to managers to decide what they're going to do with that input, but they have to actually communicate back. And I'm just thinking about a case of a CEO who just got the job and asked everyone, what's exactly those questions. And he gets like a list of 13 major things, and 13 is a lot. So he looked at it, got everyone back in one room. It's one of his big major town hall meetings, and he said, look, 13. Now, these 3, I can take a decision and they're solved. I'll take a decision. These 5, I have no idea. And these 7, I don't think they're priority. Off they go. And I think that's exactly what is needed. Crowdsourcing is not a decision tool. Crowdsourcing is an input tool, and we have to be humble in that and see it like that and create the expectations around it.
One quick thing, if I may offer an example of what's going on in crowdsourcing. We're working on a very discrete project on cybersecurity to assist local governments. As you know, cybersecurity is a real issue. It's probably the most pressing issue in the public sector these days. And I don't know if you heard what happened in Atlanta. There was ransomware, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of Bitcoin demands. And one thing that we're working with right now in terms of crowdsourcing is using these white hat, as people are saying, white hat hackers to come in and to assist in the bounty hunting exercises to identify vulnerabilities across local communities. To the credit of crowdsourcing and the leveraging of all this multi-talent, the cost of doing business for local governments has just dropped dramatically to do this. It's something that really helps them as the tax rolls continue to decrease, right? So this is a real live example, in partnership with Homeland Security of the beauty and the power of crowdsourcing. Again, you're gathering data, gathering intelligence, identifying vulnerabilities, but it's not a decision-making tool. Again, that falls to other people, but it helps lower costs, improve safety, security, lower vulnerability, and eradicate these bad actors. So that would be, I know we are short in time, but I just wanted to share that example of that. This stuff does work. It goes beyond just the glossies.
Great, yeah. Well, thank you. I think we have to wrap this up. I guess what I wanted to say in closing was, when I think of crowdsourcing, I think when a lot of people think of crowdsourcing, what immediately comes to mind is maybe the outsourcing of tasks. And what this panel really showed, I think, is that there's this use for crowdsourcing maybe inside an existing structure rather than disrupting a structure that's gathering intel and inputs to then filter up to whatever your existing decision-making structure already is. I think that's a really interesting, compelling use. It's opened my mind to something new about crowdsourcing and how it fits into all of our jobs, potentially. So thank you all so much for sharing that.
Great. Thank you all.